Welcome to Anthodish, the show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Sarah Dugan. Spend too much time on the internet these days, and you can walk away with a lingering sense of body shame, dietary uncertainty, and overall not great vibes. To me, this means it's all the more important to reflect on our relationships with food and reassess how we think about them. My guest today, Shana Spence, is one of the central people that I take a lot of inspiration from when it comes to healing relationships with food. Shana is a registered dietitian nutritionist based in Brooklyn, New York. Her debut book came out this past August 2024 and is titled Live Nourished, Make Peace with Food, Banish Body Shame, and Reclaim Joy. She currently works in public health for the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, doing community nutrition lessons, and also owns her own company, The Nutrition Tea. She describes herself as an all-foods-fit dietitian and creates a platform for open discussion on nutrition and wellness topics that are inclusive, non-diet, and weight-neutral, all with an intersectionality of social justice. She also writes frequently for publications such as Self, Shape, Outside, and Well and Good magazines. Speaking engagements include Peloton, NIDA, Eating Recovery Center, The Rose Retreats, Foodfluence, Eat Well Global, and NBC. She can be seen in media such as NPR, Shape Magazine, GQ, Self Magazine, Women's Health Magazine, Outside Magazine, and Healthline. Today, Shana joins me to discuss some of the key themes to her book, Live Nourished, touching on how diet culture persists in post-secondary educational spheres, the funny but persistent and weird ways that wellness culture permeates our eating choices, and how to break away from the idea of food as a moral choice to think about nourishment in a more holistic, individual, and cultural way. Here's my conversation with Shana. Welcome to the show, Shana. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Good, good. I'm so thrilled to have you here. I've been such a longtime fan of your work and your writing, and your latest book has just been like such a joy to read. So very excited to chat with you about it today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me too.
So before we kind of jump into the bigger topic of today, do you mind sharing a snapshot of who you are, where you're coming in from, and the type of work that you do?
Sure. So my name is Shana. I'm a registered dietitian. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York. And so I do work in public health. I describe that as my actual 9 to 5 job, but I also post a lot. I also write a ton. And yeah, I have a book out now that is based on more of like an all foods fit type of philosophy. Eating not based on restriction. And so I'm super excited about it.
Awesome. Yeah, I very much admire the balance because I have a 9 to 5 as well, and I know how much it takes to kind of like pivot between those things and the kind of online expectation versus reality of life that comes with that.
Yes, I know.
So something that really struck me early on in your book is that you are very, very honest about how you kind of came into your perspective within nutrition. And the line that really hit me was that you noted that you got an education in diet culture rather than nutrition. So in your perspective, what sorts of things make an educational space like a place where diet culture can persist that way?
Yeah, I think that for many of us who are in the health fields, I notice that a lot of our schooling is based on numbers. I mean, every school is different, but I just remember constantly being taught how to make people smaller and without really talking about the side effects of that, the mental health aspect, even the physical side effects of that. And so when I said that, it's because, not that I'm putting down my school, but I think that sometimes we're so focused on diets and weight, we're not really looking at the person as a whole. And so I I think about that a lot even now when I'm working or if I'm counseling somebody, even in public health, we have to look at more factors, I think. And I think that when we're constantly talking about restriction, we're not really able to look at the person as a whole, like the person as a person. And I think that's so evident because we're not taking things like a person's lifestyle into consideration, like their access to food into consideration, all of these things that are super important. And you can see that because we know, many of us can, finally say now that we know diets don't really work. That's why it's constantly like a weight cycle. So I feel like sometimes the focus is always on weight, even in schools, like always trying to get somebody smaller without really looking at them as a whole. So that was, yeah, that's why I kind of wanted to even write the book. And also that's why I mentioned that in the, I think that was the first, I can't, oh my gosh, I can't even remember. I think that was like the first chapter because I was like, it's true.
Yeah, no, honestly, I felt the same way. And like, I hadn't thought about my own educational experiences like that until I read that line. And I was thinking back to like my early nutritional anthro courses where there was a lot of measurement, and it was really looking at measuring bodies as a way of describing health and nutrition. And
Hmm.
yeah, it very much reframed it in my mind, even though I kind of moved past that. I hadn't done the work to like think about the consequences of that in education.
Yes, yes, for sure. I know because I think, you know, and I say like people in the health fields as a whole because, there are many, many of us, but I think that sometimes even when I've had like doctors reach out to me as well and say, I've never really thought of it like this until you said XYZ. And that's the whole point. Like I'm not trying to tell people that their thinking is, wrong as a whole, but I just want people to kind of think maybe we're not doing, maybe we can rethink how we're teaching. Maybe we can also rethink the concept of health as a whole because there's much more than
Hmm.
weight loss. So that's my goal.
Yeah, yeah, it's fantastic to and like very refreshing, I think. And given your experience working not only like the online realm, but very much working with patients, what happens when you approach health and nutrition that way in terms of like relationships and connections to patients?
Yeah, definitely. So when I work in public health, I do nutrition lessons. I work with people of all ages. And, it's always interesting because I think we're all living in the same society. So we all kind of are fed these concepts by the media and by what we're reading and seeing on television constantly. And I always get questions about like if I eat X, Y, and Z, will I lose weight? Or if I eat X, Y, and Z, or maybe I shouldn't eat that because, the chemicals in the food or things like that. So, it's really people are just curious about what they're eating and how to better nourish themselves. And I think that, you know, my hope is for people to realize that eating is individual, right? And I always point
Mhm.
this out because even when I'm working doing my nutrition lessons, most of those folks are in the lower income tax bracket, let's just say that. And so many times there's a lot of guilt I notice around food and not being able to afford certain things, or they think that they have to eat, I don't like kale, but I force it. And I always say you shouldn't have to force yourself to eat something you don't like. It's so funny because many people don't like kale, but they feel like they have to eat it. I say there's other things that we can eat, I don't know why we're force feeding ourselves kale, but and that's just an example of, so people I think everyone knows and wants to be healthy according to their own bodies, but I think that there's a lot of confusion. And I see that across people of all demographics, but the thing is that I think there's a lot of guilt when somebody can't afford it or that it's not accessible. A lot of times, a grocery store isn't within walking, like I live in New York, so many things are walking distance, and sometimes a grocery store that's well stocked with fresh produce isn't within distance, and many people here don't own a car. There are factors like that. So I always try to incorporate that in my lessons and when I'm talking to people. We can talk about food all day, but we really need to also talk about, the lifestyle factor that many people.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something in kind of like that broader diet culture discourse. There's, it's a very, what's the word? Like it's always looking at what you can achieve or like
Mhm.
what's aspirational rather than like meeting people where they're at and the very real circumstances and very different circumstances that different people have as well.
Exactly. Exactly. I think that's a good yeah, I always say that because sometimes even when I first started out in public health, like I always had these ideas of what I was going to tell people as far as nutrition. It's crazy. Well, in my defense, I was obviously a lot younger and very new to the field. So, I didn't have the information that I have now. And so I'm thinking, yeah, just tell people to replace their white rice with brown rice, or tell people to just, eat something
Mm.
like kale instead, or like instead. You can't really do that, and I mean, for some people, yes, can suggest things, but you really have to look at a person's culture, for one, a person's access to food. And I think looking at the person as a whole, that's what I mean. I think it's so important. So yeah, a lot has changed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like one piece that I really like within your work and something that like the message, I don't think you can hear it enough, but you even just thinking about kale, like these foods have so much social value or like moral value put
Hmm.
on them. And so I wonder, in your work and your lens, how do people kind of untangle these sorts of moral values from the foods that they're seeing in the grocery store, like the pressure that they might feel to eat kale when there's so many other types of greens that you could eat too.
Yeah, I think it's really hard for people to kind of separate the morality from whatever, because when you think about it, it starts at such a young age. So one of the nutrition lessons that I do is with children, and some of them are as young as like 3 years old. And when you're in the classrooms, you'll already see teachers have good foods and bad foods. And you'll see like pictures of, obviously bad foods are going to be like cookies, ice cream, quote unquote bad foods.
Hmm.
And the good foods, of course, are fruits and vegetables. So they're already internalizing something like that. And, with kids, they're like sponges. So that type of thought process isn't going to go away. They pick up on everything. And, I even get them telling me about mommy's diet, or, dad doesn't do this. He just works out instead of eating, so they pick up on all of these things. And so it's so hard for us to kind of separate that morality from food because we've learned it from a young age. And so I tell people all foods have a place, all foods fit. We just kind of have to remember why we're eating certain foods. Yes, something like kale or something like spinach is going to provide us with, fiber and vitamin K and, calcium, all of these things. And potato chips aren't going to provide some of those things, but that doesn't mean that potato chips are bad. Sometimes we just want something crunchy, or we want to celebrate with food. Food is also social. It's also a way for us to connect with other people. It should be comforting, and I feel like sometimes even comfort foods are kind of labeled bad foods, but I think there's so much
Hmm.
nuance with that as well. So, it's hard for people to separate the good foods, bad foods, because we've learned it from such a young age and it's internalized. And so that's one that I think is the hardest one for people, because even walking around, grocery store, of course you're gonna be, you're gonna point to like an apple and say, oh yes, I'm gonna eat healthy, or, an apple is healthy. And yes, an apple is healthy, but, it doesn't really mean that other things aren't healthy. So it's hard for people to work on. And that's another goal of mine, is to, try to work with people on that. But it's difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It takes a lot. And I think there was someone that I spoke with on the show a couple years back, and I always think about like they were doing some research on purity culture in the Bible Belt because that's what they grew up in. And
Yeah.
they even just pointed out all the types of yeah, like Halo ice cream or like all these very religious connotations to it as well. And like it's one of those things where once you stop to look at the grocery store and like you see all these, even just the
Yeah.
names for things or how things are described, it's just, as you said, it's so deeply interwoven into food.
It, what's so kind of interesting to me, because when you think about like the term clean, right? Like clean foods or clean products, drinks, whatever,
Mm.
first of all, we know, as dietitians that that has no meaning. Like it's just a marketing gimmick. But to me, it's also comical when I when I hear of a food being described as clean, because I actually did a deep dive of the history, and that stems from, because we were talking about the Puritan culture, that stems from very religious roots and having
Mm.
clean and being, and I don't want to get, it might be TMI, it might be inappropriate, but a lot of times food, like when we talk about
No.
cornflakes or graham crackers, that was big in the
Yeah.
Puritan days. Why those foods were invented, your thoughts. I'll just say that. And then people can pick up what I'm
Yeah.
putting down. But yeah, but that's where the
hmm
clean foods movement started from. And so I kind of chuckle at it because now it's still in full force, but I'm like, do people realize that that's the that's the history of clean foods?
Yeah. I know. I don't think so.
Yeah.
Like, I think there was the point too in your book where you're talking about like spices and how
Yeah.
like European culture really modified the idea of spices. And I had no idea that was kind of like why European foods ended up being so bland.
Yeah, like when you really do a deep dive into history, and I think I'm like a history nerd because there's a show, I think it's on the History Channel, I'm not sure, but I think it's called The History of Food or something like that. And so I love it because it gives you information like that. So then I wind up doing more research and finding out, oh my gosh, this is true. Like with the clean foods, it was a whole episode on Dr. Kellogg, and the whole spices
But
thing was like another episode. I said, this is amazing. People don't realize this. Yeah.
yeah. And like the lasting repercussions too, right? Like we think about, North American foods and I don't know, I always see it as like there's a fractured relationship between us and our foods and not necessarily thinking about how these are like really historical influences that have gone on to shape, even just stigma around spice use and culturally appropriate foods for different people within America itself.
hmm it's so true. It's really fascinating because even though we're talking about history from, years and years ago, kind of it's still working its way into present day thinking. As far as like with the spices, I still hear people talking about wanting to eat food with less spice because they think that if something is palatable or the spices will make something too palatable, that's bad. And again, that line of thinking was
Mm.
from like 200 plus years ago. And so it's still carrying it's still carrying with us today. Same thing with the clean, as I just talked about, the clean foods, even though I don't think people are saying clean food for the same reason as Dr. Kellogg
Yeah.
did back in the day, but the line of thinking is still somewhat there. It's still sort of this elitist type of connotation. So it's really interesting how things have stayed with us as a
Yeah.
society.
Truly, especially considering like that food just doesn't taste good without flavor. Like at the
Yeah.
end of the day, I don't want boiled chicken. I want it
No,
covered in
exactly.
things.
Yeah, exactly. And I always joke, like, I would never eat unseasoned food, or I always say the only foods you should avoid are, the ones you're allergic to, of course, or the ones that are unseasoned. And I mean that. Because food should
Yeah.
taste good. It should taste good.
That kind of leads me into my next question as well is, your book is called Live Nourished, and I'm curious to get your perspective on like what does nourishment look like for, I mean, obviously different for everybody, but what's your hope that people understand this idea of nourishment as given all of the things that we've talked about today?
I think that, definitely, like you just said, it's for sure individual. I think a big problem that we see someone eating a certain way or someone telling us that this way worked for them and we think that we can just copy and paste and it will work for us, and that's not necessarily the case. So it's definitely individual. It's definitely also taking into consideration what you as a person, like your lifestyle, even if you have access to, let's say you have a Trader Joe's, a Whole Foods, and like another grocery store, if you're working 12 hours a day, on different shifts, or you have multiple jobs, those grocery stores, not that they're meaningless, but it's not going to still help you get fed. And so sometimes maybe that means buying things that are packaged, that are frozen, that are canned, for your convenience. So I think that nourishment is going to look different, but also know that nourishment doesn't just mean the most expensive. It doesn't mean, the fresh, only fresh fruits and vegetables. I'm a big fan, actually. I prefer frozen myself because I call my
Yes.
vegetables raw the hospice, because I always forget about my vegetables in there. I love frozen. But yeah, that's what it's there for. It's convenient. And, I think that when I say convenient foods, people think that I'm talking about, a dollar bag of chips or something like that. It's like, no, I'm talking about foods that are convenient. Maybe buying one of those containers with the onions already chopped because you don't have time. It cuts down on cooking time. Things like that. I think that that's what nourishment means. Like, it's really about finding not only the foods that work with your body, but also the lifestyle. Like, maybe buying more convenience foods that look packaged. And that doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means that you need that for your lifestyle. So I think, yeah, it's all of those things.
I love that. I think it's also refreshing to hear that take because I think quite often, it feels like it's always this all or nothing approach to food. So if you're not mincing your own garlic, is your dish going to be like a culinary masterpiece?
Yeah. Exactly, exactly. I mean, honestly, I was in Target the other day and I got so excited because they have their own like minced garlic cubes, like the frozen ones. And I said, this is
Oh,
perfect. So I have it in my freezer because there are times if I am making something, I don't really feel like, if it's 8 o'clock at night already, I want something fast so I can just throw that in. So that's, yeah, it's just, some things are just meant to be convenient, and that's okay.
yeah. That one sounds particularly cool.
Yeah, yeah, I was very, very excited when I saw that. I bought two bags.
Nice. You have to, yeah. So something that really I found interesting in your book is reading through the second half looks more like a workbook. And it felt like, you're not necessarily talking at people, and it felt more like it's sparking a conversation or like personal reflection. So I'm curious what were sort of the motivating forces for structuring your book like that.
Yeah, I think that I could have just written so the first part of it is really talking about like more of history with diets, and more of the science behind why those that doesn't work and all of that. And I could have continued that conversation for sure, but I also didn't. I felt like I didn't want to leave people hanging, because I felt like at the end someone would say, "Okay, but now what? Like, what do I do
Mm,
now?" So I kind of wanted to give, at least some tips. And those tips, I don't counsel right now anymore, just scheduling wise. But when I used to do one-on-one counseling, that was how I used to walk through my counseling sessions. We talk about, here's an example of what you can do. Here are some tips that you can take into, and make them tailored for you. Because I don't remember the chapter, but I definitely gave tips on like some snacks that people can have throughout the day, or like, breakfast options that are quick and easy. So things like that are some tips that I usually do with clients regardless. So I kind of wanted to kind of make that a whole chapter because I thought it would be helpful for people, because I didn't want to just leave them hanging. So that was my
yes.
goal, to kind of just walk through, okay, this is why, what we know now in society about diets, we know that they don't work. Here's why. And then the second half is, well, here's what you can do. Because I am a dietitian. So, yes, I want you to be nourished. I want you to be fed. And here are some tips that you can use to do that. So that was sort of the goal behind that, for sure.
Awesome. Yeah, it very much again, it's one of those moments where I was like, "Oh, this is what a book can look like," especially from like a nutritional healthcare expert, where it's I think because I had so much time in academia, I immediately just think of like hyper academic kind of speaking down tone. So it was really cool to see a totally different take on it.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Just because I really do, I want to come from a place of not speaking down to people.
Mhm.
Because quite honestly, I think that most people are coming from that restrictive mindset, and you know, not that people are just going to be rude, or like the weight loss industry is so aggressive, but I think that sometimes you need to be more understanding of people's circumstances, and that's sort of the tone that I wanted to set throughout the book. So thank you. I'm glad that it came through. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it really, when you pull in the idea of like the weight loss industry in particular, it kind of resets your mind or like creates new cognitive pathways where you're like, it doesn't have to be this like fear-mongering or stigmatized approach. Like it can be a lot more enjoyable and it can be individualistic as well.
Yes, yes. Definitely the key, individualistic for sure. Yeah, that's my one hope for people, is just to really have them realize that, it's okay to eat different from your neighbor, or even, a family member. You just have to do what works for you personally. So, yeah.
Yeah, totally. So, in terms of, I feel like I always end with like big hit questions and I always feel badly about it. But I'm curious if you have advice for people who are, listening to this and it might spark something in them, but they don't necessarily know where to start. What's something that you would recommend to that person?
Yeah, I think that it's definitely it's not going to happen overnight. Whenever we're talking about having a healthy relationship with food, or kind of even, letting go of that morality attached to food, it's not going to happen overnight, because it's hard. We're all living in this society, and we're constantly being fed information that's, can be a little triggering. So I get that, but my one piece of advice, sorry, my one piece of advice is to always think about what foods you can add to your day in order to provide nutrients. I think that that's more helpful, because it doesn't help to tell somebody, don't eat this, don't eat that. If you're really looking for nourishment, always think about what to add. And it can start from breakfast, even fruits. I know that people sometimes, because fruit is sweet, we think that it's not good for us, and that's not true. Fruit is definitely providing a ton of fiber, a ton of vitamins, minerals, all of that. So,
Yeah.
I always tell people, how can you add in more fruits or vegetables to your day? How can you even maybe add in just a little bit more sleep? And I wasn't joking when I said I was also working on that, because sleep is also something I'm working on. Even if it's going to bed starting half an hour earlier, trying to get in more sleep, because sleep is definitely a huge
Mm.
part of our health. And of course, de-stressing and all of that. So I always say, just like little increments, how to start small and then build up, I think is more helpful.
Yeah, yeah. And it feels much more realistic to like where people are at in a very busy, very, capitalistic lifestyle that we are
Yes,
experiencing collectively. So,
for sure, for sure. Yeah. Because I think that many people have that all or nothing approach, which, sounds great. Like, yes, I
mm.
can just change, but, like you said, capitalism, we're all working very hard. And so sometimes we just need to work small and just build up from there.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Shauna. It's been such a pleasure getting to chat with you. Do you mind sharing where people can look online if they want to learn more about the work that you're doing or your book?
Sure. So all of my social media is the nutrition tea. So I'm very easy to find. um, I even sorry, I even have a Substack called The Nutrition Tea, and my book is actually available everywhere, even in the UK, which is very exciting. So it can be ordered online or at your local bookstore. It can be borrowed from the library. Also audiobook. So it's called Live Nourished.
Thank you so much, Shauna. It's been such a pleasure getting to chat with you today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
That was Shana Spence. I've linked her book Live Nourished as well as her social media and websites in the show notes below if you want to follow along and learn more. You can also find all this at our website at anthodish.com under episodes. Thanks for listening to Anthodish Podcast. Subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If If you like this show, please rate us on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out. For more Anthodish, you can find us at anthodish.com or on TikTok, Facebook, or Instagram at Anthodish Podcast. I always love to hear from you and what you're thinking about food. Anthodish is produced in partnership with the American Anthropological Association. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week.